In March of 2024, Ruth Callahan stood in a Dade County, Georgia courthouse and paid $1,100 for 50 acres nobody else in the room wanted, land so thick with kudzu that two previous owners had already lost equipment trying to clear it. She was 44 years old, and she had no idea that within 6 weeks, 14 goats would refuse to cross one specific line on that property, or that what they were refusing to walk into had been growing in secret, in perfect rows, for 30 years after everyone who planted it had disappeared from the record entirely. $1,100 was not, as some people would later assume, an arbitrary price or a giveaway. It was the exact sum of 4 years of unpaid county property taxes, penalties, and administrative fees, because that is how a tax deed auction actually works in Georgia. The county doesn't sell land for nothing. It sells land for what is owed on it, because the county's only real interest in a delinquent parcel is getting the tax rolls balanced again, not turning a profit on somebody's misfortune. $1,100 for 50 acres was still, by any honest measure, next to nothing. It was next to nothing because nobody else in that courtroom wanted it. She'd read about the parcel in the legal notices section of the Walker County paper the way she read most things that ended up changing her life, by accident, half paying attention in the 10 minutes before evening chores. 50 acres, tax delinquent since a woman named Opal Renfro had died without a will in 1998, the property drifting through more than 2 decades of accumulating debt until Dade County finally scheduled it for the courthouse steps. Ruth had 14 Angora goats at the time, a scrap of rented pasture, and a small business selling raw mohair fiber to hand spinners that brought in, on a good year, a fraction of what her family's dairy operation had once cleared in a single month before it collapsed in 2009, under feed costs that climbed faster than milk prices ever did. She had watched her father sign papers in a bank office that ended 40 years of a herd her grandfather had started, and she had walked away from that afternoon with one very specific, very stubborn conviction. Whatever she built again, she was building small enough that nobody could take it away from her in a single signature. It wasn't a virtue she'd chosen, it was a shape her life had been forced into. By the time she stood in that courthouse watching an auctioneer describe 50 acres of heavily overgrown, kudzu-affected pasture land, condition unknown, sold as is, she recognized something in that description that most of the other 7 people in the room clearly didn't. Overgrown pasture sold as is was exactly the kind of land nobody with real capital wanted, and exactly the kind of land somebody with patience and no capital could actually use. She won it at $1,100 against a single other bidder who dropped out at $900, and she drove home with the receipt on the passenger seat and no clear idea what she'd actually bought, because winning a Georgia tax deed auction doesn't hand you clean title on the spot. It starts a clock. Whoever held the property before the sale, or their heirs, has 12 months from that date to redeem it, to pay Ruth back the purchase price plus a 20% premium, plus any taxes she paid in the meantime, and take the land back outright. Until that year passed, or until she completed a separate legal process to formally cut the right off early, what Ruth owned was a tax deed, not a warranty deed. Land she could work but couldn't fully insure, couldn't borrow against, couldn't sell with clean title. Her attorney explained it to her in about 4 flat, unbothered minutes on the phone and told her that in his experience, most redemptions that were ever going to happen happened in the first few months. The odds dropped fast after that. They never technically dropped to 0 until the year was up. Ruth wrote the auction date on a card and taped it to her truck's visor. She had, at the outset, 365 days before she'd know for certain whether the land was hers. The property itself, when she first walked it 2 days later, was close to recognizable as land at all. Kudzu had been in that part of Georgia since the 1870s, brought in originally as an ornamental vine, then planted deliberately and enthusiastically across the South by the Soil Conservation Service in the 1930s and 40s as an erosion control measure, before anyone fully understood what an unchecked vine with almost no natural predators in this climate would eventually do. Left alone, a single kudzu vine can put on several inches of new growth in a day and will climb, smother, and eventually kill nearly anything in its path simply by blocking the light beneath it. 50 acres, abandoned since 1998, had given it 26 uninterrupted years to do exactly that. 2 previous attempts had already failed on that exact ground, though Ruth only pieced this together slowly, from a neighbor named Gail Prater who ran cattle on the adjoining parcel. A logging outfit out of Chattanooga had tried clearing part of the hillside with heavy equipment back around 2015 and given up inside of 2 months after a bulldozer went into a sinkhole nobody had known was there, hidden entirely under the vine mat. An investor from Atlanta bought the tax certificate the following cycle, tried again with a bigger crew, and walked away after roughly the same money and the same frustration. "Nobody around here calls it pasture land anymore," Gail told her, leaning on her own fence with the patience of someone delivering a warning she didn't expect to be heeded. "We just call it the Renfro land. Everybody knows what that means." Ruth thanked her for the warning and bothered anyway. She borrowed a stock trailer from a man 2 counties over, promised back within a week, and hauled 14 Angora goats, 6 rolls of portable electric fencing, and 2 1,000-gallon water tanks up onto that hillside with a plan built around one piece of biological fact rather than mechanical force. Goats will eat kudzu readily and repeatedly, stripping leaves and tender growth down to bare vine, and if grazed hard enough over successive seasons, will genuinely exhaust the plant's root reserves in a way no single pass with a bush hog ever could. Cutting kudzu without controlling regrowth just prunes it, and pruning is the one thing kudzu has spent a century and a half getting very good at recovering from. The first week went exactly the way Gail Prater and everyone else on the county road expected. Ruth spent whole days hauling water uphill in 5-gallon buckets, moving fence line by hand through vine mats so thick she sometimes couldn't see her own boots, and coming home each evening with her arms scored red from vine and briar. Trucks slowed to watch. She heard, secondhand, that the general read around the gas station in town was that the Renfro land had claimed a 3rd owner before it had even had the chance to claim her outright. By the 3rd week, the goats had cleared close to 2 acres, and the hillside began for the first time in decades to show itself. Bare patches of red Georgia clay emerged where nothing but shade had lived for years. A line of old cedar fence posts, silvered and split but still standing, came up out of the vine like something surfacing out of deep water. Ruth found a section of dry-stacked stone wall running nearly straight for almost 40 feet, careful enough in its construction that it had clearly been built by someone who meant it to last. The trailer's owner drove out near the end of that 3rd week expecting to hitch up and take his equipment home. He stood at the fence for several minutes, looking at the cleared ground and the stone wall and the goats working the next section, then told her to keep the trailer another month. It wasn't a large gesture in the way he said it. It turned out to matter more than almost anything else that spring, because without those extra weeks, Ruth would have run out of time and animals before she ever got far enough up the hillside to find what was waiting near the top of it. By the 6th week, the goats had settled into a routine that covered the entire property except one corner near the northeast boundary, close to where the stone wall ended. Every morning, all 14 animals walked to the exact same invisible point at the edge of a dense wall of vine, stopped shoulder to shoulder, and would not go another step no matter how she moved the fence line to encourage them forward. She assumed there was a simple explanation, a den, a sinkhole like the one that swallowed the logging company's bulldozer, something dead in the undergrowth. She checked the ground herself twice and found nothing. By the 3rd morning, watching all 14 goats stop at that same line for the 3rd consecutive time, she understood she wasn't looking at coincidence. She was looking at a pattern, and patterns, on land that had already swallowed 2 previous owners' worth of equipment and money, were not something Ruth Callahan had any intention of ignoring. She walked back down to her truck, took the machete off the passenger floorboard, and started up the hillside toward the one place her animals had refused 3 mornings running to go. The first swing cut cleanly through fresh vine. The second did too. The third struck something solid, and it wasn't the flat scrape of stone and it wasn't the give of a fallen branch. It was wood, and not the soft, rotted kind that should have been the only kind left on a hillside abandoned for 26 years. She pulled the hanging vines aside with both hands and found herself looking at bark, rough with age, wrapped around a trunk that was still unmistakably alive. She cut a wider opening, and almost immediately, a second trunk came into view a short distance from the first. She thought little of it at first. Mature trees weren't unusual on neglected land. But as she kept working her way forward, something about the spacing began to feel deliberate in a way she couldn't yet name. Another trunk, then another beyond it. She stopped cutting and looked more carefully across the hillside, and that was when she saw it. The trees weren't scattered the way trees scatter when nature reclaims ground on its own. They stood in straight, evenly spaced rows, each one positioned with the same careful distance from the last, stretching farther than the small opening she'd cleared could show her. Someone hadn't let these trees grow here. Someone had planted them on purpose a long time ago, and then the land had swallowed every trace of that decision along with everything else. As more light came through the opening she'd cut, she noticed fruit hanging low beneath the leaves, rough-skinned, uneven, colors running from deep crimson into patches of pale yellow, nothing like the uniform apples stacked under supermarket lighting. She picked one, turned it over in her hand, and understood, standing there with a half-cleared machete cut behind her and 14 goats patiently waiting downhill on a hillside nobody else had believed was worth saving, that she wasn't standing in a forgotten woodland. She was standing in a forgotten orchard, and whoever had planted it had done so with more care than the county's tax rolls or anyone else's memory had managed to hold on to. It took her 4 more days of careful cutting, working row by row instead of at random, to reach the old foundation at the top of the hillside. A collapsed one-room structure, likely a tool shed or a small smokehouse, judging by the low fieldstone footprint and the rusted remains of a wood stove half buried in leaf litter and fallen timber. She was clearing debris away from the base of that foundation, more out of curiosity than any real plan, when her boot caught the edge of something metal buried just under the surface of packed leaves and soil. She knelt down and dug it out with her hands. A tin box, roughly the size of a shoebox, its lid rusted nearly solid, one corner crushed flat under decades of settling ground. She worked the lid loose with the flat of her machete, carefully, and inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and had long since gone brittle and dark, she found pages. Not many, perhaps 30, covered edge to edge in careful, cramped handwriting that survived remarkably intact inside that sealed tin, listing dates going back to the 1940s, tree numbers, and words she didn't fully recognize yet. Rootstock, scion, graft union. Terms that meant nothing to her at that moment, but that she understood, holding those pages in the fading afternoon light with 14 goats grazing steadily below her on a hillside nobody else had believed was worth saving, were the reason this orchard existed at all. And very possibly the only surviving record on Earth of what it actually was. She called an orchard specialist 3 days later. A retired extension agent named Delbert Cash, who had spent close to 40 years cataloging heirloom fruit trees on abandoned farms across North Georgia and East Tennessee before he'd officially retired, and who, according to Gail Prater, hadn't actually stopped doing it since. He arrived on a Thursday morning with a canvas bag, a hand lens, and a small spiral notebook of his own, and walked the rows slowly, saying almost nothing, stopping every few trees to examine a leaf, study the bark, or measure the spacing between trunks with a length of knotted cord he pulled from his coat pocket. The longer he walked, the quieter he got. Ruth followed a few steps behind him, watching him grow more careful rather than more excited, which struck her as backward from what she'd expected. Eventually, he stopped at a tree near the center of the third row, reached up, and picked a single apple. He didn't say anything. He unfolded a worn pocket knife and sliced it in half, and instead of the pale, uniform flesh Ruth was used to seeing, the inside was streaked with faint pink running from the core toward the skin, dense and richly colored in a way she'd never seen in an apple before. He picked another from a different tree, then a third from the row beyond it, cutting each one the same careful way. "I don't think some of these exist anymore," he said finally, lowering the knife. He explained it to her the way a man explains something he spent his whole life being quietly frustrated that more people don't understand. America had once been home to more than 17,000 named apple varieties, developed over generations by ordinary growers to suit different soils, different climates, different needs. An apple bred to keep through a hard winter without a root cellar, another bred specifically because it made better cider than eating fruit, another because it ripened 3 weeks earlier than anything else in a particular valley, and that mattered to somebody once. As commercial agriculture consolidated around a small handful of varieties that shipped well and looked uniform on a shelf, thousands of the others simply stopped being planted. Most weren't deliberately destroyed. They were abandoned, one orchard at a time, and once nobody was left who remembered a name or grafted a fresh scion from the old wood before the original tree died, the variety was gone for good, because an apple tree doesn't grow true from seed. Every apple tree that shares a name is not the descendant of some ancestor tree. It's a physical clone of it, kept alive only by grafting living wood from an existing rootstock, generation after generation. Once the last living graft of a variety dies without anyone taking a cutting from it first, that specific apple is gone from the earth permanently, in a way no amount of seed saving could ever bring back, because its seeds wouldn't grow the same fruit even if you planted every one of them. The kudzu, he told her, hadn't killed this orchard. By swallowing the hillside, it had done the opposite. It had hidden the trees from logging crews, from development, from the 2 men who'd already tried and failed to clear this exact ground with equipment heavy enough to have taken the trees down without ever noticing what they were. Ruth showed him the tin box that evening at her kitchen table and watched him go still in a different way than he had out on the hillside. The pages inside were a grafting ledger, kept in careful handwriting by someone who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. Dates, tree numbers matched to rows, and beside many of them, names. Not scientific names, local names. The kind a family gives a variety when they've been growing it for themselves for 2 generations and never once needed to write down where it came from because everyone in the family already knew. Delbert read through the pages twice, comparing tree numbers against his own notes from that afternoon, and told her that between the ledger and the trees themselves, he believed at least 6 of the varieties on that hillside were ones he'd only ever read about in old agricultural bulletins, presumed extinct for decades, with no known living specimens anywhere else on record. The ledger wasn't just a nice piece of history. It was, as far as he knew, the only surviving document on Earth that could connect those specific trees back to their real names. The last page of the ledger carried a signature, Eugene Renfro, dated 1971. Ruth sat with that name for a long moment before she said anything. Renfro, the same name on the tax records, the same name Gail Prater had used without elaboration, the Renfro land. Everybody knows what that means. Opal Renfro had died in 1998, owning 50 acres nobody in the county remembered as anything but overgrown. Ruth had assumed, without ever really examining the assumption, that whatever the land had once been worth had died along with her, quietly, the ordinary way most things go. It hadn't occurred to her, until she was looking at Eugene Renfro's signature in her own kitchen, that Opal might have had family who simply never knew what she'd left behind, because by the time anyone might have come looking, the orchard itself had already vanished beneath the vine, and there was nothing left on the surface to suggest there had ever been anything here worth remembering. The story got out faster than Ruth expected, and not because she'd tried to spread it. Delbert Cash mentioned the ledger and the 6 presumed extinct varieties to a contact at the University of Georgia's Extension Service purely out of professional habit, the same way he'd have mentioned any other significant find in 40 years of doing this work. From there, it moved to a small piece in the Walker County paper, the same paper where Ruth had first read about the auction. And from the paper, it reached exactly the kind of person county legal notices are technically public for, but rarely actually reach. Her name was Denise Renfro Walsh. She was 51 years old, lived 2 hours away outside Rome, Georgia, and she was Eugene Renfro's grandfather and Opal's great-niece. And until she read that newspaper article, she had no idea the 50 acres her family had once owned outside Trenton still existed as anything other than a name that occasionally came up at holidays. In the vague, half-remembered way families talk about land nobody living had ever actually seen. She called Ruth in July, 4 months after the auction, with 8 months still remaining on the redemption clock. Ruth had known, in the abstract, distant way you know about a possibility you don't expect to actually happen, that this call could come. Her attorney had explained the redemption right to her back in March in his flat, unbothered voice, one fact among several, and she had taped the auction date to her visor and mostly let the number of days quietly run down in the back of her mind without dwelling on it. She had not expected, when the possibility finally became an actual person on the other end of a phone call, for it to feel the way it felt. Not like an attack, exactly, because Denise Renfro Walsh's voice on the phone was careful and a little uncertain and clearly nervous about how the call itself would land, but like the ground under something Ruth had genuinely started to think of as hers, shifting in a direction she'd known, the whole time, it was legally entitled to shift. Denise wasn't calling to threaten anything. She was calling because she'd read about a rusted tin box with her grandfather's name signed at the bottom of it, describing an orchard she'd never once heard existed. And she wanted, more than anything else in that first phone call, simply to see it. Ruth invited her out the following weekend. Denise walked the rows the same way Delbert Cash had, slowly, and Ruth watched her stop at the same section of dry stack wall Ruth had uncovered back in the 3rd week, running her hand along the top of it without saying anything for a long moment. Eugene had died in 1988, Denise told her eventually. Opal was his sister. As far as anyone in the family had ever understood it, the land had simply been let go after Opal passed, swallowed by taxes and time the way a lot of small rural inheritances quietly are, when nobody left in a family has the money, the proximity, or the specific knowledge required to hold on to ground that isn't actively producing anything anyone can see. Have you ever inherited something, or nearly inherited something that turned out to matter more than anyone in your own family had known how to explain to you? A piece of land, a box of letters, a sign at the bottom of a page nobody thought to read closely until it was almost too late? And have you ever wondered whether the thing that was actually lost wasn't the object itself, but simply the act of somebody, anybody, remembering to look? Denise exercised her right of redemption in September, 5 months into the 12-month window, paying Ruth back the $1,100 plus the statutory 20% premium, plus the taxes Ruth had covered in the meantime, a little over $1,400 total, which was, by any measure, an almost absurdly small sum to be the exact number separating Ruth from full, permanent ownership of what she'd found. The land, under Georgia law, was Denise's again, cleanly and entirely, the moment the payment cleared. Ruth had known this was possible from the first week her attorney explained the redemption clock to her, and she had told herself more than once over those 8 months that she understood it and had made her peace with it before it ever happened. Standing in her own kitchen holding the check Denise had written her, she found that understanding something in advance and actually losing it were 2 very different kinds of knowing. But Denise didn't simply take the deed and walk away, and this was the part neither woman had fully planned for going into that September afternoon. Denise had no interest in farming the land herself, no herd, no equipment, no experience with an orchard that needed exactly the kind of patient, ongoing management Ruth had already spent 7 months learning how to give it. What Denise wanted, she said, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with the same tin box between them that had started the whole thing, was for the orchard her grandfather had planted to actually survive, properly documented, properly credited, actually cared for by someone who already understood how to do it. And she offered Ruth a long-term lease on the orchard acreage specifically at a token rent, with Ruth continuing the goat-based clearing and management work she'd already started, and both their names going forward attached to whatever the orchard eventually became. It wasn't the outcome Ruth had spent 8 months quietly hoping for. She had wanted, if she was honest with herself, to own it outright, the the way she'd wanted to own something outright ever since the afternoon her father signed away 40 years of a herd in a single meeting. She didn't get that. What she got instead was a lease, a partnership with a woman she'd known for 2 months, and a name on the deed that wasn't hers. But the orchard itself survived, fully identified now, 6 varieties confirmed against agricultural records that had listed them as extinct. The ledger itself donated to the University of Georgia's Agricultural Archive, with both the Renfro and Callahan names attached to its provenance. Delbert Cash took grafting wood from every variety that following winter and distributed it to 2 other orchard preservation projects in the region, so that for the first time in decades, those 6 varieties existed as more than one aging, hidden stand of trees on a single hillside that a single legal document could, in theory, still put at risk all over again. Ruth still walks that hillside most mornings, the same 14 goats, a little older now, working sections of a fence line she long ago stopped needing to move by hand alone. She doesn't own the ground beneath her boots. She has made her peace with that in the particular, unfinished way people make peace with things that still occasionally catch them off guard on a quiet morning. But the trees are still there, still bearing fruit nobody had tasted in generations, and the ledger that named them survives somewhere safer than a rusted tin box buried under 30 years of leaf litter. And most mornings, walking those rows, Ruth finds that the second thing matters considerably more to her now than the first one ever really did.